Hello, this is Chuck Stull looking at change in the automobile industry and the decline of the big three. We ended last time around 1970 with a comfortable oligopoly in the US auto industry led by General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler. They were not competing very strongly on price. They were not competing very strongly on features. They were not competing very strongly with new products. They were earning high profits. They were paying high wages and benefits to unionized workers. Now, today, they have a really different situation in the industry. And some of the problems that we are seeing now started in the 1970s. So let me start with that history, and we'll look for parallels to the recent problems in the auto crisis and perhaps try and forecast some things with our current economic situation. So I want to look at what happened to the auto industry. And some of the causes of change were really due to some macroeconomic troubles the United States was having in the 1970s. There was a significant recession in the 70s, and consumer demand for autos followed the business cycle. As national income went down, the demand for cars went down. And that made it hard for the industry to maintain its oligopoly price. We started seeing rebates, which were essentially discounts or price cuts. We saw subsidized financing, so low interest rates, below market interest rates in order to encourage purchases. And we saw leases introduced as a common way for people to acquire new vehicles. Essentially, we had the breakdown of the price leadership model that had been so successful. Now, because the 70s was a period of stagflation where we had both recession and inflation, the auto industry was hurt in another way as well. So one thing, in response to inflation, the Federal Reserve implemented tight monetary policy, which increases interest rates. And because most people need to borrow money to purchase a new automobile, car sales dropped. Separately, but relatedly, the United Auto Workers had cost of living adjustments or COLA clauses in their contracts. This meant there was an automatic increase in their wages to account for changes in the price level or to account for inflation. And so we have, for the automakers, an increase in the cost of production or decrease in supply at the same time while the demand has dropped because of lower incomes. And companies that were more vertically integrated, like General Motors, made this worse because there were more parts that were produced under union contract. And so those costs were going up as well, and it made it more difficult for the companies to switch to a cheaper supplier. Also, on a national level, the US was suffering from oil shocks. So these we talked about a little bit when we looked at the oil industry in 1973 and 1979. These oil shocks contributed to recession and inflation. They probably are the major reasons for that, supply shocks. But they also specifically led to increases in gasoline prices. And that meant consumers wanted smaller cars, cars that were more fuel efficient. And those cars were low profit to the US automakers. They had never really emphasized that as an important segment. And imports became important as consumers looked for small cars that were more fuel efficient. We also had a policy response. The US government response to OPEC was to push for increased efficiency, trying to use less oil. And they implemented for the first time the corporate average fuel economy standards, or CAFE standards. And the goal was to double the miles per gallon in a decade, from the average of around 14.8 miles per gallon in 1973 up to 27.5 miles per gallon in 1985. And in order to reach those, the auto manufacturers needed to sell more small cars despite having lower profits and higher labor costs. Now, those standards did continue to become tightened as people were concerned about fuel efficiency in the future, or as policymakers were concerned about fuel efficiency, with a goal had been, the most recent goal had been a 2025 target of 54.5 miles, although that looks like it is going to be on hold. The third really important factor is that Americans started buying imported cars. The domestic producers went from controlling nearly 100% of the market to about 2/3. And the first imports of important were from Europe with Volkswagen, but shortly afterwards, the Japanese producers became substantial players in the US. They became a new source of competition, and they were not part of the traditional oligopoly. And to start with, they came in with small cars. Now, there were a lot of discussions back in the 70s and 80s as to why the imports were doing too well. Like many industries, US automakers blamed cheap labor, but economists analyzing the industry found that auto workers in Japan earned the same differential as US automakers, and depending on the daily exchange rate, were earning higher real wages than US auto workers. But Japan still was a very effective competitor. And a big reason for this is that Japan at that time had much higher productivity. Now, if we went back to 1960 and looked at how many cars were being produced per worker, there wasn't that much of an advantage to the Japanese producers. The US producers' average cars per worker ranged between 8 and 14 cars. In Japan, it ranged from 12 to 15, so a little bit better. But by 1983, the US had improved only very, very slightly, so going from 8 to 14 to 11 to 16 cars per worker, but Japan had more than tripled their average productivity. So while the US car averages were between 11 and 16 cars per worker, the Japanese producers were producing 42 to 58 cars per worker. So they had fewer hours per car, and that gave them much, much lower cost because they were a more efficient producer. In addition to the production efficiency, they were also using better inventory practices, the just-in-time inventory. They had faster design, and their errors per car were, the build quality at that time was better. Now, that has changed since that time period, but we will come back to that in a little bit. There was a policy response to the rise of imports, and these are known as voluntary export restraints. But this was essentially a quota that the Japanese government imposed on its own auto manufacturers in response to threats by the US government, right, who had said, we will put on quotas if you don't put quotas on. And so the imports from Japan were by law restricted, and the Japanese imports went from about 1.82 million cars to 1.68 million cars. So a reduction of a little bit under 200,000. And that led to price increases. The estimates for Japanese cars were that price increased by 20%, and because the US was facing less competition, the estimates were that US car prices increased 6%. So consumers were paying more in order to try and support the big three. So price increases, a very expected and intentional impact of that policy, but there were some important unintended consequences. Before the import restrictions, Japan was importing cheap economy cars, very, very basic cars in a segment that the US automakers were essentially ignoring. After the quotas, they started bringing in, because it was a quantity count, it's like if you can only bring in a certain number of cars, bring in better, higher priced cars. And so they went to mid-sized cars with options, and cars like the Camry became very, very direct competitors with the US sedans. And eventually they started bringing in real luxury cars like the Lexus. What the US automakers found is by trying to protect a weak element of their market, they faced real competition in their profitable main market segments. They might have been better to just give up that small, unprofitable small car fringe. The other important change is the Japanese producers started establishing production plants here in the US in order to avoid the quotas. They became the new US producers. And so that started with Honda in 1982, located in Ohio, Nissan 83 in Tennessee, followed by Toyota, Mazda, Mitsubishi, Subaru, Isuzu, BMW, Mercedes-Benz all came in later. And that led to geographic change because these new car companies, new car producers weren't locating in Michigan and the upper Midwest. We saw a move from auto production centered on Michigan and the northern Midwest. The transplants still centrally located in the country, but were shifting much further south. Now, these transplants were brand new auto plants. They were very efficient in terms of their production, and the big three weren't able to keep up. By 1985, General Motors was using 160,000 workers to produce 3.5 million cars across a couple of its divisions. Toyota, a smaller company, overall was producing 3.5 million cars, but instead of 160,000 workers, they only needed to pay 60,000 workers. So this structural change has meant that U.S. producers faced new competition that couldn't be controlled by tariffs and quotas because these were companies with international brands or international labels, but produced in the United States using U.S. workers. Now, eventually, they realized that this was a new world and that comfortable, profitable private club of an oligopoly had changed forever. And so we saw some really painful structural changes by the big three during the 1980s, lots of plant closures and layoffs, some wage concessions by the auto workers. We did see real improvements in quality in terms of the U.S. producers, and we saw a lot of competition and innovation. Things that might have taken decades suddenly were being introduced and brought to the market in a number of years. So that suppression of non-price competition ended, and we saw all kinds of new features, multi-valved engines, fuel injection, anti-lock brakes, and whole new product segments like the minivan introduced by Chrysler in '83, followed by the SUVs and then compact SUVs, small SUVs, as well as full-size SUVs, the crossovers, the hybrids, and the plug-in electrics. So we did see, as a direct result of new competition, some real change. We also saw some important structural change in the U.S. auto industry. Chrysler had been struggling through the early part of the 80s. In 1998, after Chrysler had been bailed out by the U.S. government, Mercedes-Benz bought Chrysler, and they held that until 2007, where they sold it to a private equity group here in the U.S. We also saw a lot of joint ventures between U.S. auto producers and Japanese auto producers. Perhaps the best known of these was a joint venture in California between Toyota and General Motors, known as NUMMI, or the New United Motor Manufacturing, that opened in 1984 and operated until 2013. But there were other joint ventures between Ford and Mazda, between Chrysler and Mitsubishi. Now, these were, for the most part, U.S. plants, operating using some Japanese manufacturing management techniques, and they were more efficient than the traditional US plants. Now, the company leadership wanted to transfer the techniques to other factories in the US, but they did face resistance from US managers who did not want to change. So running from the 90s and into the 2000s, there was an important emphasis on efficiency in the US auto industry, something that they hadn't had to worry about as much during the very profitable years of the mid-century. They looked at a lot of changes in supply chain management. There was vertical disintegration, where companies sold off some of their subsidiaries. So General Motors spun off Delphi in 1999, a parts division. Ford spun off Visteon in 2000, again, making it an independent company. Also, in terms of supply chain, they were looking for more modular designs, buying fewer, more complex components in order to reduce the total number of suppliers. They also adopted the just-in-time inventory management, and so we had suppliers still located close to the auto alley of I-65, Interstate 65, Interstate 75, a north-south corridor, because with tighter inventory management, you needed to make sure that your suppliers were close by, certainly within a day's drive. Transplants were basically on the same corridor, but further south. The results of all these investments is that the big three did become much more efficient. By 2007, they were nearly equal to Toyota, industry leader, in terms of productivity, where they're using 32 hours of labor per car versus Toyota's 30. Whereas 10 years before, they were using 50% more labor than the industry's best. Now, they did have a problem, is that consumers had become accustomed to Japanese cars and liked the high quality and low prices, or the value, and the U.S. companies found that they were at a disadvantage in many parts of their own market. And so there was a continuing market share that was going to imports, but the big three had really adapted to becoming smaller, more efficient companies. This is Chuck Stull talking about decline of the big three and change in the auto industry. Thank you for listening.